Welcome back to Jail Psychologist. Last week we talked about the problematic incentive structure between many municipal governments and county governments. This week we're on the topic of city and town courts once again. Our focus this time is on why city and town courts don't evaluate defendants for competence to stand trial. And once again, this video is not intended as an indictment on municipal governments. I have friends and colleagues in municipal government. We're just discussing problems with structures and incentives. So, what is competence to stand trial? In the US, a person cannot be legally tried for a crime, nor can he accept a plea agreement if he is not competent to do so. What does it mean to be competent? The definition of competence used in the US court system is drawn from the 1960 Supreme Court case Dusky v. United States. It established what we call the two-pronged test for competence. In order to be considered competent, a defendant must A. understand the nature of the charges against him, and B. be able to aid his attorney in his defense. If the defendant is unable to do either of these things, he is considered legally incompetent. And this is true regardless of whether the alleged crime is a felony or a misdemeanor. In a criminal case, any party, the prosecution, the defense, or the judge, can raise the issue of competence. If a case can be made that the defendant is likely to be incompetent, or if the court is unsure, the court will usually order two independent evaluations for competence by a forensic mental health professional. Now, who the court considers a professional in this context differs by state, and some states allow competence to be determined by only one evaluation when the case is a misdemeanor. I've talked before about competence, but to review briefly, if a person is found incompetent, then the court will order competence restoration, which usually, but not always, involves a trip to the state psychiatric hospital for a couple months. If the hospital can restore competence, they send the defendant back to pick up their criminal case where it left off. If competence can't be restored, the defendant may remain hospitalized for extended periods, sometimes for years, through repeated review and extension hearings. There's more nuance here, but I'm trying to be brief. The issue of competence comes up frequently when the defendant in a case has serious mental illness, usually something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but there are myriad conditions that can impede someone's competence. Now, it's important to note here that just because someone has a diagnosed mental illness, that does not automatically imply that they're incompetent. Many people with serious mental illnesses are able to live normal and functional lives with the aid of medication and other treatments. Also, some symptoms are highly localized or specific and may not cause impairment in a way that would impede their understanding of their charges or their ability to aid their attorney. With that foundation established, we can now talk about the difference between how competence is handled or not handled in municipal and county courts. Most county courts are familiar with all this, and they have money set aside in their budget to pay for outside clinicians to evaluate defendants for competence whenever the issue comes up. When someone is found incompetent, the county judges will have someone in their office liaise with the state hospital system, and they'll write an order for the defendant to be moved to the hospital when a bed becomes available. As I mentioned earlier, some courts do things a little differently by having outside clinicians come into the jail to do competence restoration on site, but this is the exception rather than the rule. Now, that's how county level and higher level courts handle competence. But what about city and town courts? Well, if you watched my last video, I discussed how the primary purpose of city and town courts is to retain local control and to generate revenue. The thing about competence evaluations is that they're a little on the expensive side, especially if you're doing them frequently. A quick and dirty competence evaluation costs between $500 and $1,500, while a thorough evaluation in a high-profile case usually costs between $3,000 and $6,000. I was speaking to a county judge from a more densely populated part of my state last week, and she told me that their court spends about $800,000 a year on competence evaluations. In any case, city and town courts don't usually have budgets for competence evaluations. So what do? Well, there's what they technically should do, and then there's what they actually do. Technically, the court cannot move forward with a case if the defendant is incompetent. The correct and constitutional thing to do in these cases is either to find a way to pay for a competence evaluation, transfer the case to a county court which is capable of addressing the competence issue, or to dismiss the case on the grounds that they can't proceed. There are cases and times in which each of these solutions makes sense. However, I will note that most county courts are not usually keen to accept a transfer on a case with a mentally ill defendant who comes with the additional price tag of needing a competence evaluation. However, most city and town courts don't routinely choose these options. Instead, they use strategies that exist in a sort of legal gray area. There are two that I've seen used fairly consistently. First, they might proceed without formally raising the issue of competence. This works because unless one of the parties officially goes on record to say that the defendant seems incompetent, no formal evaluations need to be ordered. There's an obvious risk here that any ruling in the case could be overturned on appeal because the court failed to note that the defendant was incompetent. However, the risk for this is low because most of the defendants who find themselves in this position lack the awareness or resources to file an appeal and usually don't have anyone on their side who understands the law well enough to notice the problem. The second thing I've seen municipal courts do is to keep resetting court dates and continuing the case so that it stretches out for 3 or 6 months. And once again, I don't mean to imply that a judge would necessarily do this on purpose. They might just keep resetting court because the defendant fails to appear and the judge might not even know that the defendant is mentally ill. Whether it's intentional or not, once the defendant has been in the jail for a few months, the court has the option to give the defendant a plea deal for time served. This means that the defendant has already spent the same amount of time in jail that they would have had to serve had they gone to trial and been found guilty. Depending on your jurisdiction and statute, defendants may get 2-for-1 credit for being in jail. That is, they get credit for 2 days served for every 1 day of actual time they spend in jail. In a jurisdiction like this, spending 6 months in jail gets you credit for 1 year, which is the maximum penalty for a misdemeanor in almost every state. The downstream costs of these strategies are twofold. First, this dynamic risks undermining the spirit of the constitutional protections involved. It's called a right to a fair trial, not the right to be pushed through a legal system you don't understand or forced to sit in jail for an extended period of time because you're mentally ill. The second issue, as I discussed extensively last week, is that these strategies often result in extraordinary costs to the county taxpayer. A city court judge may have a defendant in custody for 6 months in one of these cases, sometimes without even noticing that the defendant is mentally ill. Meanwhile, this person is costing the county $100 a day in routine jail costs and may need an expensive antipsychotic medication that costs $2,000 a month. The total cost for an inmate like this might be $30,000 over 6 months when the inmate was originally arrested for trespassing. All this causes financial and constitutional issues. The right to a fair trial shouldn't be optional. It shouldn't depend on the size of your town or the size of your court's budget. It's a constitutional safeguard. And when we quietly bypass it like this, we end up not only increasing and shifting costs, but weakening our shared concept of justice. If we care about both fiscal responsibility and constitutional integrity, this is a gap we can't afford to ignore. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.